Hello, I've been working on this video for over a year. It was originally intended to, celebrate the upcoming hit film Napoleon, and then my house caught on fire. And then my computer exploded. And then I had to, make a lot of very stressful road trips and phone calls and family meetings. And then my hard drives died. I tried, but I evidently could not make this big video in time to capitalize on the best Napoleon film of the 20s. This turned out to be an enormously deep topic to tackle, the biggest, deepest iceberg of gaming history I've gone down so far, and honestly something that should be beyond the wheelhouse of most video games media in general. Because getting into Napoleon's contribution to game history means getting into gaming's ideological history. A history of how revolutionary changes in math, thinking, and politics have since become unconscious default assumptions that have gradually become modern gameplay archetypes since then. I've taken the extra time to expand from focusing on Napoleon himself into making this more of a history of a game genre, one where Napoleon himself did play a big part. The historical trend for technology's relationship to art is that technology gets developed for pragmatism first, before it gets adopted by artists later. Computers were not invented to make video games, just like how photography was not invented to make movies, just like how writing was not invented to write fiction. And as it turns out, most modern strategy game core concepts and rule sets were originally created as deadly serious military training tools for simulating the real thing. And today, playing and developing war games is a very real and very important part of a modern military officer's duties, a tradition that started 200 years earlier when those war games were first developed out of military necessity to defend against Napoleon. And I think that is a very sobering but very enlightening history that I do believe every single gamer should at least be vaguely aware of. The family history of the strategy wargame genre shows us how humans have fantasized about warfare for centuries, and how modernity fundamentally changed the fantasies that are implied by gameplay mechanics. So if you're uncomfortable with the idea of video game violence representing or reinforcing real-world violence, or if you've ever questioned the metaphors you've been using inside your head to navigate the gruesome abstractions of this genre, buckle up, because it's not just me. There is definitely a kind of tragic, morbid, or poetic weight added to a lot of the thoughts that hit my head when playing games like this. Almost every button you're gonna press in almost every strategy game represents some of the most complicated and difficult actions of a state bureaucracy functioning inhumanely smoothly. Strategy games are the most immediately obvious example of how games are political. Countless generations of sacrificed lives are at work when your mind imagines what a mouse cursor that clicks on little soldiers to give them orders actually represents, and what must be going on in their little world that turned these little men into machines.
The ways forward.
But I'm not just interested in what the player's actions represent metaphorically, but also why the players' and the developers' minds land on the metaphors they do. What outside forces influence our minds into imagining what a game's graphics do not show on screen? Like, what is represented by your cursor in the simulationist logic of these games? For this topic, that seemed like a question actually answerable by looking at the historical context going on during the creation of the modern strategy game genre, which I'm going to argue began 200 years ago during the Napoleonic Wars. But Napoleon's life carried cataclysmic consequences even for things he wasn't personally interested in. Napoleon the guy would become Napoleon the setting for tabletop strategy games, and for a little while in the 80s, computer strategy games. There is a ton of history shared between board game tabletop world and electronic computer game world, and so many barriers between the two really look superficial from this perspective. So to start us off, I'm going to spend some time explaining what bedrock of inspiration the Napoleonic wargames from 200 years ago were working with, from over 2,000 years ago. The history of turn-based strategy games might as well begin with the history of human civilization itself, stretching far back into Antiquity. where the earliest recorded gaming sets have been discovered in Mesopotamia, where history's earliest recorded gamers were enjoying some kinda probably backgammon ancestor here, circa 5,000 years ago. Before games were ever about fighting big battles, they were more interested in imagining a race to a finish line. The most ancient of ancient games were naively ignorant of the topic I'm really looking for here. The games depicting large-scale battles and wars, the ancestors of chess and checkers. There are artifacts from ancient Egypt 3,000 years ago painting a slightly more complete picture of some of the most basic battle strategy game concepts emerging from those earlier racing game concepts. They are the partitioning of simulated space into a square grid and the deliberate movement of representative tokens across this grid under competitive circumstances. Also, a very important thing to note about ancient Egyptian games is that they had no fear about employing luck or randomness in gameplay. Ancient Egyptian gamers were casting lots as their version of a random number generator. A handful of sticks dropped on a flat surface generates your random number. The equipment is there, but we don't have surviving documents for the rules of these Egyptian board games. Reconstructionists are working from inference. A more complete record of documents survives from the Greco-Roman world from 2,000 years ago, where we have writings from several ancient authors about a checkers-like game that frequently shows up in archaeology digs from all corners of the Roman Empire. The Greeks called this checkers-like game pedia, or polis, while the Romans called it ludus latrunculi, or latrunculorum. This game, with those titles they gave for it, make it the earliest surviving written language that imagines game tokens on a game board as little groups of soldiers fighting a battle. The Greek name polis referred to a vision of this gameplay depicting the founding conflict of a new city-state. That there was the assumption that founding a city-state involved a conflict already says a lot, but the Latin name, ludus latrunculorum, was even more militant. That translates to something like the soldier's game. The Romans believed in military conquest being its own self-fulfilling justification for governance, and this gameplay was involved in reinforcing that kind of ideology. Latrunculi plays kinda like checkers, in that the idea is to clear an 8x8 or 8x12 board of your opponent's pieces through some kind of simulated combat, moving one square's worth of 4-way orthogonal distance per turn. But what's so different from checkers, and so relevant to how it reflects the particular way Romans imagined battle, is that the simulated combat requires simulated flanking. The gameplay does not depict anyone winning a direct face-to-face one-on-one fight. You have to trap one of your opponent's pieces between two of your own pieces, presumably depicting the strong defensive power of Roman shield wall formations. It is remarkably easy for a modern mind, full of Ridley Scott movies and Total War games, to visualize lines of shield walls trying to stretch their extremities around each other and encircle. In other words, two armies of evenly matched Iron Age heavy infantry phalanx-style formations. This gameplay represents one of the endless small-scale city-state versus city-state battles fought between heavily armored, highly disciplined formations supported by a wealthy state. It's a game depicting the so-called civilized warfare between privileged families who could afford to pay hundreds of men to fight decked out in heavy armor, fighting over stakes so small, so frequently, in front of so many relatively safe spectators that these little battles were regarded almost like a sport, like a game. For hundreds of years of antiquity, refining these phalanx tactics was what the world's military doctrines revolved around. For a very, very long time, the world's most powerful warmongers seemed to enjoy assuming that the only thing that could beat a good phalanx were two other good phalanx. Without some kind of defensive flanking or encirclement maneuvers, battles between these evenly matched states would often end in stalemates. And so, the rules of this game depict how those stalemates could develop and how to break them. That hard requirement for a 2-on-1 numerical advantage implies that none of the soldiers on the board are individually weak on their own. Each piece can defend against an evenly matched opposing piece forever. In fact, none of the historical weaknesses of those heavy armor formations were being depicted. In real life, it didn't work like this propaganda. Gaps in the shield wall of a phalanx would open up when the group had to make a turn, so they were very slow and couldn't move around uneven terrain safely. So in the game, the battle's terrain is always a perfectly flat, perfectly square grid. In real life, these heavy armor formations were often embarrassingly beaten by lightweight projectiles. Archers, slingers, and javelin men could just run around them in circles, fishing for openings at a safe distance. So, among the conflicts within ancient Greeks and Romans and their ultra-prideful ideologies, using projectiles was controversial. It was hated. Sometimes using projectiles counted as a war crime by treaty, and so in the game, projectiles were just not depicted at all. There's a variant of this game that employs a unique piece called a basileus, wanax, rex, or dux piece that's kind of analogous to the king of chess. Capture this one and you win the whole game without needing to clear the other units out. However, unlike the units in chess, the dux piece itself is invincible to the normal methods of capture. It has to be captured by being completely surrounded and rendered immobile, even if it's his own men blocking his escape. And this is another ideological rule. It says more about the political assumptions made by ancient Romans than it does the reality of ancient warfare. And that is how, for the majority of human history, soldiers were swearing their allegiances to individual people instead of abstract national causes or constitutions, which is why this Roman aristocracy stuff is going to have a lot to do with the Napoleon stuff later on. When it came to administering a conquered foreign territory, the victor of one of these ancient Iron Age wars was expected to keep the enemy king alive and use them as a puppet ruler to prevent revolts later on, because of just how obedient the soldiers would still be to their defeated king. An enemy king being killed in battle could spoil or reverse the victory. And under these assumptions of, aristocratic totalitarianism, commanders were supposed to be captured and ransomed instead of killed like the common soldiers, but that is not how things often turned out in real life. So in the game, the generals and kings really are invincible. The terrain is unrealistically flat, the pieces move unrealistically straight, projectiles and missiles are unrealistically absent. So below the surface of a match of La Trunculorum, there's this fantasy of nobility and respectability for what this game's culture thought their ancient battles should look like, and not like what they actually did. They didn't have any of the math or media to take aim for realism. Instead, they had poetry. Realism was not a priority for the developers and players of this game, but some kind of representative fantasy still was. In order to break the stalemate and snowball up a victory, both players have to take some kind of big, exciting risk that will involve some kind of heroic sacrifice for the greater strategy. And even when playing it by myself in 2024 on a computer screen, I still managed to somehow get very excited about imagining what these pieces were representing. Depending on the situation, they represented something tragic or morbid, or heroic and inspiring. It's actually really exciting to play, and one of the most popular mediums that excitement got verbalized with was poetry. Similar to the original audience, I am kind of obsessed with Homer, and this game very easily got the voice in my head to improvise heroic little Homeric episodes of bravery and tragedy playing out over the match. And that's so fortunate because a common interest in Homer should be the natural point of trying to relate to the original audience here. Epic poetry was the mainstream pop culture equivalent of the day, so Homer's particularly visual poetry would have been a popular reference point for ancient people who were seeing images of stone circles on a scratched grid, but imagining more visually detailed images of shining metal soldiers living out the most glorious moment of their lives. There was a Latin poem commissioned for some rich Roman family that talks about this game with so much enthusiasm and excitement that it might as well be marketing copy on the back of the box. This poem survived, but it is reasonable to assume there were many more like it that did not. And despite modern poetry's associations, please remember that ancient epic poetry was bawdy and schlocky. It was supposed to be the action-packed, exciting mainstream entertainment. Just listen to this last line here. I love it. And however keenly the battle rages with cut-up soldiers, you conquer with a formation that is full or bereft of few soldiers, and each of your hands rattles with its band of captives. Automatopoeia, our hands are rattling with captives. That is referring to some kind of sense of game feel you would get from your fingers grabbing up all your opponent's shiny little stones and feeling like a badass about what that represents. It is timeless. This sounds like modern game designers talking about how good it feels to rattle around the go stones. And noticing that both the modern and ancient Roman mindsets seem to get significantly bigger thrills from quantifying imagined combat down into pure logic, much more thrills than what the upcoming medieval mind is about to do, should be deeply thought by all of us later on after this video. Now, despite its apparent similarity to checkers, and despite a hunch many historians have had that Latrunculi would eventually evolve into chess, the gaming historian I'm primarily relying on here claims there is a split. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, in fact please do, but the claim I'll go with for here is that the fall of the Roman Empire and the disappearance of so many of its records meant that Ludus Latrunculorum would become forgotten, and that strategic Western wargaming history picks back up in medieval times with an import from India instead. Chaturanga, the king's game of chess. Chaturanga means four branches, or four limbs, because the game depicts the four main branches of the ancient Indian military: infantry, cavalry, elephants, and chariots, as the mechanics steer things a bit closer to what we'd nowadays call a combined arms field operation or something like. This game spread into the east to eventually become shogi, and spread into the west to eventually become chess. Now, have you ever wondered why chess pieces move, unrealistically? A castle turret tower looks like a stationary piece of construction, but zooms around with speed and mobility. You can control the whole match with these. They can safely speed ahead of your lines in one direction, but they have a hard time making turns, kind of like a car or a carriage or a chariot! Haha! It turns out that is why the castle turret tower is moving around so fast in chess. Centuries after chariots themselves became obsolete and castles became the new cutting edge, Europeans turned the chaturanga chariot into the chess rook, but didn't really change the rules, just the way the piece looks. The knights teleport in an L shape, mostly for abstract game balance purposes, but also to evoke the relative speed and maneuverability of light cavalry charges, now possible in medieval Europe thanks to another Asian import of stirrups. And the infantry, the pawns, are certainly no longer the main focus of what kind of battle is being imagined here, and just how abstract and metaphorical the word battle can get. Chess marks a big leap in complexity over Latrunculi, an increase in complexity that wouldn't have happened without an upgrade in graphics. The different pieces have such different moves from each other that players need to imagine a ton of invisible information at a glance. And that requires far more hours of fancier craftwork than Latrunculi did, whose one and only type of piece could be represented by coins, rocks, scraps of cloth, just trash. Chaturanga, and chess, on the other hand, existed in the realm of elaborate aristocratic finery, a game for the upper classes, who had an interest in carving out increasingly fancier gaming sets. Archaeological finds from the so-called Dark Ages have shown a remarkable amount of labor, for that time period, was being spent on making pieces for this game. And so it became a kind of edutainment pastime for the militant medieval aristocracy, who continued to be obsessively interested in claiming descendancy from the ancient Roman aristocracy. Chaturanga made its way to the west through Iran and Arabia, where they called it shatrang, and then into Europe by way of Spain around 900 AD. Us English speakers call it chess because the Germans called it Schoss, after the game-winning move where you capture the Shah, the king. And from this point on, gaming history does become decidedly more German, Prussian in particular. But throughout its whole existence, chess was never really thought of as being a realistic portrayal of the ancient Indian army. While the game displays a recognition of the value of potentially someday simulating warfare, there still weren't any presumptions of what we'd call realism. The advancements needed for realism and the demand for it are still a long way off. So the metaphorical conflict behind a battle of chess was often imagined as being about something bigger, about different social and political classes, about the bishops and the kings acting together harmoniously under a unified authority during any number of conflicts that could face a medieval kingdom, rather than the match just being a depiction of one individual battle or even literal battles in general. To the medieval and early modern aristocracy, and I'll quote my gaming historian John Peterson here, who is referencing a Gustavus Solinus from the early 1600s here, chess was more than just a game, it was a model of politics and strategy. Solinus believed chess exemplified a number of lessons for rulers, such as how weak the king would be without the organized support of all his subjects. Thus, it did not matter if the rook looked like a castle but moved like a chariot. The point was more to show how deeply politically reliant kings were on their castles, their bishops, and their knights, but also on every pillar of society. Their cloth makers, their smiths, their laborers, their physicians, their apothecaries. In this respect, the battles, depicted by chess, are far more metaphorical than the ones in La Trunculi. It had been centuries since Roman times, and while the real-life spear versus spear fighting tactics weren't actually that different, the way that medieval people visualized war and their relationship to it was. It made sense for the definitive war game of a more Christian world to be a more intellectually rigorous metaphor for a more rigorously metaphorical worldview. Chess was taught as a lesson for aristocratic male teenagers who might be expected to lead armies at some point in their life, and as such, that class did slowly develop an interest in more realistic simulation games over centuries. A push for realism finally starts to appear after the intellectual mathematical breakthroughs of the Enlightenment period. When people started getting interested in cutting through all these religious metaphors with more rational explanations, those interests trickled into gaming with the very first attempts at making chess arguably realistic. To be fair, chess rules were not really standardized on a global scale until the 19th century, and back in the late 1600s, more and more complicated chess variants kept coming out. New versions expanding the board, or adding 4 to 6 player multiplayer versions, or they'd buff or debuff or patch out familiar old pieces and drop gameplay rebalancing updates that added tens more. It's Christoph Weichmann's 1664 version, the Kreigsspiel, that's remembered for being the most complicated. Weichmann's Kreigsspiel employed a giant interconnected mandala of circles instead of a grid. Players had 2 copies of 14 unique units that added up to a total of 30 pieces for 6 players who will be sliding around little marshals, colonels, captains, chancellors, couriers, and, adjuncts? Adjuncts? In other words, pieces that represented a more contemporary vision of 17th century warfare. And these rules were so convoluted, in fact, that future attempts at improving chess after Weichmann's generation were really just making what modern historians now consider to be completely different game types. Weichmann's version of Chess 2 was popular for a century, but during that century it was inspiring even more complicated chess variants, trying to emulate all the differences between cuirassiers, dragoons, and hussars, and it ultimately was just too much. Too complicated and becoming too different from chess for game historians to consider the following reactions and reboots as part of the same historical branch. And after witnessing this cycle happen a couple times in my own lifetime, I am very amused to report that games like Weichmann's Kreigsspiel gradually lost their appeal because of unpopular complexity. A century after Weichmann's King's game, the concept of kings themselves started to become unpopular, and a frustrated German game developer will be wiping the slate clean to make a simpler, more streamlined reboot. In 1779, Johann Christian Ludwig Hellwig was Master of Pages of the Free City of Braunschweig of the Free German State of Brunswick. The pages he was a master of were pages in the human sense. They were students bound for military service, probably officers. And despite not having military experience himself, Hellwig was evidently enough of a math and science savant to create for his students the progenitor war game, the branch in gaming history's trunk where modern turn-based strategy finally starts growing out of the tree. Despite this upcoming name I'm gonna butcher, historians do not consider Hellwig's wargame as a chess variant. Hellwig reinvented the concept, but he was still working with the existing vocabulary, so he first called this new game Versuchen auf Schachspiel gebauten taktischen Spiels von zwei und mehreren Personen spielen. An attempt to build upon chess a tactical game which 2 or more persons might play. In 1803, the game was updated and the title shortened to Kreigsspiel, War Game. And just look at how familiar this image should be striking you if you've ever spent childhood hours with an Advance Wars or a Fire Emblem growing up. So long as you've played any square grid strategy game made out of 4-cornered pixels for a 4-way D-pad, this image should look absolutely uncanny. The game space is made out of square tiles representing plains, forests, waters, mountains, or roads, and all their associated movement effects are what you are already familiar with. Mountains are impassable, swamps slow you down, and water blocks your way. Unless, in this game, you can use engineers and an extra turn of time to build a quick bridge. The blockiness of Hellwig's game, through a modern set of eyes, even gives it a pixel art sort of look. This is begging wild chicken and egg questions. He even designed it with graph paper, just like how modern game developers working with pixels will do. Also, ideologically similar to Advance Wars, and a useful gauge for judging how modern rather than medieval this game is that Hellwig's Kriegsspiel is won not by capturing a king, but by occupying terrain, specifically the fortress tile. Capturing an administrative building is now being depicted as a higher priority than capturing the king. Also, the tile-based terrain can be rearranged and customized. It's a prototypical map editor. There's over 1,600 grid spaces to start with, and even bigger customizable battlefield sets were sold like 18th century expansion packs. But while Hellwig's design demonstrated a big evolution towards depicting military movements, it seems to have come at the sacrifice of a simpler depiction of combat. Hellwig was downsizing Weichmann's unit count from 14 to 6 game pieces. At first, they were variants on the existing queens and bishops and such from chess, but the 1803 version streamlined things further down to just 3 units, who represented the 3 real-life military branches of his day: infantry, cavalry, and the increasingly more decisive artillery, the branch Napoleon also happened to be interested in. Infantry and cavalry came in 2 light and heavy variants, artillery came in 3. These 3 categories of units, divided into 2 or 3 tiers prioritizing strength or speed, all complement and counteract each other with such depth and elegance that modern game designers still share Hellwig's affinity for a 3-pronged rock, paper, scissors, or triangle-style balancing system. At first glance in still life, it absolutely looks like Advance Wars from 2001. But once the pieces start moving around and interacting with each other, the comparison starts to break. Hellwig's Kriegsspiel still used what the gaming historians call displacement to simulate combat. A piece moving into another piece simply bops it off the board, displacing it. But in the 1803 version, they displace from 1 or 2 squares of distance to simulate gunfire, and a handful of some of the situational game states you can run into led Hellwig to basically invent a handful of now permanent game design archetypes. A prototypical hit point system comes into play during combat over fortified positions, where Hellwig's invention of per-unit strength values creates a multiplier effect allowing finer gradations of losses. Hellwig also depicted flanking maneuvers, another innovation. A small triangle represented which direction a unit was facing, and if 2 infantry units of equal strength were facing each other, they were immune to each other. And we can also credit Hellwig's depiction of artillery as the first recorded instance in game design history of what we now call splash damage. Ironically, Hellwig's game did not catch on with the military students he designed it for, because it wasn't complicated or realistic enough for them. It was appreciated for stimulating their imaginations, but the elegance and customizability of his game meant it enjoyed more success with civilians instead of military people, who were understandably more interested in simulation than stimulation. But Hellwig's terrain squares were truly radical and revolutionary, coming after centuries of games and art were depicting the medieval world as a checkerboard grid. This plugs into a greater point. People changed what they visualized as the background of their gameplay during the same times when people were rethinking their place in the entire universe, really. The liberal revolutions over those decades included scientific revelations that impacted many aspects of life beyond politics. Hellwig's game sparked a big interest in topography as being the most fascinating challenge for later game developers to try solving, and soon other German officers started working on solutions for depicting a more accurate sense of scale. They didn't just want the general layout of a battlefield, they wanted an accurate to real-life scale model of it. For real-world militaries, it is critical to know the kinds of distances and elevations and obstacles that armies would have to march across. Hellwig's colleague, Johann Georg Julius Venturini, took the next step to solve those problems with a scaling system that would allow them to overlay gaming grids on top of the existing maps that generals were already working with. With that addition of a real-world sense of scale, gaming had taken another step away from abstraction and toward simulation. Despite the importance of this innovation, though, Venturini's scaling system turned out to be a kind of a halfway step, because the more permanent advances came from ditching grids altogether. Real-life rivers don't turn at perfect 90-degree angles, and neither do real-life armies on the march. After Venturini, there was a push to use organically messy, curvy, non-partitioned terrain, played with tape measures to scale the Kreigsspiel gameplay across real, actual maps. The very same maps officers were using for planning the real thing. Maps. Maps, maps, maps. It turns out that overthrowing monarchism and germinating the modern political imagination apparently required the advances cartography made during the 18th century. Over the two French revolutionary decades of the 1790s and early 1800s, war games would figure out how to be played on top of the very same paperwork as highly sensitive state military secrets. The maps. See, before the 1800s, you could not just go to the store and buy high-quality detailed maps of territory neither domestic nor foreign. And I could hardly believe it when I learned which individual person of this era we have to thank for so accidentally, indirectly influencing game history by making high-quality maps more affordable and available to normal civilians in peacetime. The little Corsican, Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1795, Napoleon, early in his career, was taking a break from leading battles to push paperwork in and out of a new office in Paris they called the Army Topographical Bureau. Before the French Revolution, the French military, just like most other royal monarchist militaries of their day, was not centralized at all, not operating from a consistent chain of authority that started in a national military office in the national capital city. Instead, wealthy families functioned almost like sovereign political entities. Individual households and estates were collecting taxes, raising armies, sometimes selling them to hostile foreign powers, all while funding the research and development of military and civilian sciences. Sciences such as cartography. There were a lot of high-quality maps of enemy territory locked up in the armoires and cabinets of these rich aristocratic French estates. But revolutionaries like Napoleon felt that the entire nation of France should be using them, instead of individual royal families. So, a brutal decade of devastating anti-aristocratic violence allowed Napoleon the opportunity to track down these scattered maps across the countryside, snap them all together in Paris, and then dramatically invade Italy via a surprise route in 1796. Carefully studying maps was usually the most decisive activity military officers could spend their time doing, and Napoleon styled his battlefield maps with symbols that would last centuries. Blue rectangles for the good guys, red rectangles for the bad guys. Most world militaries have since reacted by adopting almost exactly the same symbols. And you've probably seen these same symbols in a few video games over the years too. The Austrians, Prussians, and Italians very quickly developed cartography advances of their own to try and keep up with France, one of which was Venturini's aforementioned grid-line overlay version of Kreigsspiel. And Kreigsspiel quickly became an aristocratic pastime in places like Italy, Germany, and Great Britain. In other words, Napoleon's rivals during Napoleon's time in response to Napoleon's victories. In this period, at least 15 major European Kreigsspiel developers appeared, and very few of them were French. In 1793, the Italian author Francesco Giacometti released a wargame called the Nuovo Gioco de Scacchi, ossia Gioco della Guerra, and then after some certain political changes in 1801, he renamed it to Nuovo Demo Deesh au Jeu de la Guerra. But none of Napoleon's rivals were as directly influential on gaming history than Georg Leopold von Reisswitz, whose first attempts at solving the problem of simulating scale and nonlinear 3D topography involved building a custom cabinet for a sandbox. He would sculpt the battlefields out of wet sand to simulate elevation. 1793 was before the ubiquity of modern nationalism, and military officers could sell their services to both sides of warring kingdoms with no great sense of guilt, no identity crisis required. Reisswitz wanted to sell Kreigsspiel to the courts, but eventually decided not to tour Europe selling a childish-looking sandbox game to the world's most powerful people. Reisswitz backpedaled to two-dimensional porcelain tiles for a more Hellwig-style grid game before very reasonably losing interest after years of fighting the Napoleonic Wars in real life. But it was Reisswitz's son, let's call him Reisswitz Jr., who finally delivered the solution. Reisswitz Jr.'s Kriegsspiel is what would later become the definitive template for battle strategy gaming for the next 200 years. From Warhammer to Warcraft to real-life war. Modern militaries today are still using Reisswitzian gaming systems, and so too does an enormously larger market of strategy games for harmless civilians. Reisswitz's rules had one infantry unit piece simulating 2 companies of 450 men, lined up 3 ranks deep. Infantry marches at about 200 paces per turn, with one turn simulating about 2 minutes of real battle time. When blue rectangles get within musket range of red rectangles, they'd hurt each other for 1 round of damage that simulated 2 minutes of sustained musket fire. All these measures based on twos were echoing some popular military idioms of his day, particularly a quote by Frederick the Great of Prussia. Within every 2 leagues of terrain, there are 200 possible positions for infantry to take. Additionally, Reisswitz also took the final steps of developing modern per-unit strength values and modern health points, hit points, for his game, completing a transition we started earlier with Hellwig. Combat is no longer determined by displacement, but now by depleting health points from math formulas. All that greater interest in math, statistics, and data showing up as an after effect of Napoleon's wars is no coincidence either. Because a generation earlier, it was not just the aristocracy's maps that Napoleon was after. It was all their data, in general. The Army Topographical Bureau was a prototypical general staff who were not just interested in maps, but really any helpful scientific paperwork locked up by the nobility, like large collections of statistical data that helped manage La Grande Armée's logistics, finances, information, and intelligence. And sure enough, all that preparatory paperwork did result in massive armies of unprecedented size moving across Europe at unprecedented speed, to the terror of royalists everywhere. Among Napoleon's rivals, Prussia's specialty was military science, which means that shooting various guns at walls all day and recording their accuracy was a popular activity for Prussian aristocratic gentlemen. Gerhard von Scharnhorst spent day after day plugging his ears and firing weapons at walls, and compiled the resulting accuracy tables in his creatively titled Über die Wirkung des Feuergewehrs, aka in English, On the Effects of Firearms. This time period saw the birth of the formal study of statistics as a science, and it was publications like these, and their increasing availability to civilians, that bridged a data gap between military science and military gaming that eventually crossed over into civilian gaming. It's a trend that continues today with civilian game designers reading civilian publications of hardcore military statistics, casually sold to the international public. It is easy to imagine stuff like that facing greater censorship under more repressive governments. And 200 years ago in Prussia, it was only available to the Prussian aristocracy. Reisswitz Jr. directly cited these statistics to create data tables for his wargames, using real-world military data for scalable tabletop simulation, and one result was the creation of the accuracy cone. The closer infantry and artillery pieces get to their targets, the more accurate they would be, unlike in previous Kreigsspiels. Measuring that took math, and Reisswitz enjoyed crunching numbers. His rules were infamously complicated enough for the required players to jump from 2 to 3. 2 players played as the competing officers, and then a third player was called the umpire. Umpires memorized the most complicated rules and performed the most complicated calculations. The umpire was playing the role of luck, or nature, or providence, some kind of naturalistic mediator between the two sides who'd be calculating the probabilistic odds of an attack's efficiency, or the likelihood of some kind of mistake happening, oftentimes determined by dice roll. After finishing these calculations, the umpire then presented their results to each player, confidentially, one at a time, keeping their opponent's position secret until mutual simulated sightlines had been crossed. The idea was to keep the 2 competing officers relatively ignorant of the game's exact rules to see how well they could improvise clever tactical thinking. This created another Reisswitz innovation that has now become a standardized archetype, the fog of war, where you can't see your opponent's pieces. With Reisswitz Jr.'s version of Kreigsspiel, strategy game designs really stop looking historical and start looking modern. The maps are designed to be fully customizable. There's no grid, there is a sense of military realism baked into the rules because it's pulling from real-life military science, and the umpire does computational jobs that would later be done by game masters or dungeon masters and eventually by computers. By the way, did I mention that the umpire was also rolling dice as a basic fundamental routine of playing this game? That's another major design innovation that we owe to Reisswitz Jr. here, if not the greater scientific developments of his day. It's the employment of chance, randomness, or luck in competitive skill-based gaming. And the history of luck over big timescales correlates an awful lot with the history of religion, with milestones happening pretty slowly over centuries. By that I mean to say that Reisswitz Jr. may well have been the first game designer for a millennia of Western history, since ancient Egypt, to be fully comfortable with thoughts of incorporating randomness into a non-gambling game. In other words, to be fully comfortable with the predictably unpredictable chaos of the universe ruining the perfectly laid plans of those who were divinely appointed by God to make those plans. Let's get into that. Military commanders since long before the French Revolution had always written about war as being inherently unpredictable. But when it came to state-sponsored activities for rich gentleman people to do in front of their superiors in polite society, using randomness as a core gameplay mechanic still steered the associations of that activity too close to gambling for their comfort. They were supposed to be virtuous Christian exempla, after all. See, outside of maybe France, the US, Holland, and a tiny few others, the monarchist royal militants who controlled the world at this time believed that they were the arms of a divine hierarchy of kings appointed for divine rule by God. They logically concluded this because there was no more commonly convincing a demonstration of divine intervention in front of hundreds of public witnesses on the public record than by seeing who God picked to be the victors of battles and wars. Therefore, those in charge of battles and wars believed they were naturally picked by God to do so. See, Adam Smith hadn't invented economics yet, and visualizing a large-scale network of economically influenced individual decisions deciding an entire country's war effort was not the usual way of visualizing any large-scale social phenomena at all in general. But a few decades after the French Revolution, a greater tolerance, a rationalism, started to be exhibited towards using luck in mainstream gaming. Probability, chance, or luck was now a formally studied science, measurable with exactitude. Previously, randomness existed within the realm of faith, and its blasphemous cousin of gambling. To minimize this discomfort, Reisswitz Jr. used a set of 5 custom-designed die to alter the outcomes of a battle's most decisive combat actions. Artillery fire, infantry fire, and melee combat were all influenced by wherever divine gravity decided the dice shall fall. It is worth mentioning just how much distance Reisswitz wanted to put between war games and gambling. He had his dice marked with his own symbols rather than the good old ancient and unchanging numerical dots, but they function almost identically to normal game dice. In fact, he didn't even really want to call it a game at all. He just found no other words more appropriate for the activity. Reisswitz's combination of mathematics and science to luck and probability for the purposes of game design is not something we should be taking for granted. It was not an obvious solution in his time and wouldn't have been for a millennia earlier. In his time, he would have had to be thinking deeply into the implications behind the natural phenomena of the universe, and how to depict them in a new way that would have been literally unthinkable a few decades earlier. In other words, getting his mind to think those thoughts took a revolution. To recap, Reisswitz Jr. was working on his game through the 1820s, with a mind influenced by the French Revolution's decades of cataclysmic violence committed against a social class that was previously thought to be untouchable by divine protection. Depicting that situation in a game did not happen before the revolution nor during it, but 30 years after, to a new generation that grew up in the less revolutionary, more monarchist Prussia instead. Reisswitz himself wasn't even a revolutionary, but he still did this stuff. Let's put all that together in modern gamer vocabulary. Gaming got hit points, strength values, non-linear gridless movement, 3D terrain, maps, stats, and RNG, all within just a couple decades. So in the grand scale of history, strategy games as we know it were made possible thanks to advances in science and, liberalism. By that I mean science getting better at cartography and probability, and liberal revolutionaries redistributing the most nationally useful assets of the wealthy. For many conservatives of Reisswitz's day, the violence of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars was atheistic and blasphemous. A crime against the Catholic-appointed royalty, so therefore a crime against God, so therefore a crime against nature. But for revolutionaries, it was seen as the necessary cost of liberating Europe from a parasitic social class that had been bleeding them dry for centuries. The modern political map took shape from those wars. King after king after king were being toppled and replaced with more democratic governments, either by Napoleon himself or those following his example. And many of today's most basic civil liberties across the whole globe were fruits of those struggles. Human rights, codified election rules, public art museums, public schools, going to a store to buy a map. Now, I'm not saying that if Napoleon won at Waterloo, then there'd be more peace in the Middle East or anything, but I am saying that arguments over Napoleonic ideals and whether or not the Napoleonic Wars were a good thing provided the next 3 generations of art with a set of new metaphors and a new kind of nostalgic heroism that had people completely rethinking the purposes of big battle violence and its gaming associations. Using the word game as a metaphor for war was the dominant conception of it in those days, when stakes were relatively low and civilians were relatively uninterested in who their emperor was. Before national conscription, royal armies tended to be filled with otherwise unemployable drunks, drug addicts, and criminals, and so it was not uncommon for the military aristocrats to think of themselves as doing a beneficial social service of, basically cleansing their society of its least desirable people.
On, you drunken rascals! You horse melts! You thieves! You blackguards!
It was blatantly hypocritical that this barbaric brutality was being staged with all the aristocratic pomp and pretentiousness of a game of chess, but with real deaths. Officers wanted to make battles look like community fairs or festivals, where elegant vanities like fancy butlers delivering fancy breakfast to the front line was understood as a valid projection of state power into foreign territory. All of this to increase the social pressures needed to convince thousands of poor people to disobey their natural survival instincts. But monarchism's callous attitude towards death and dignity and warfare disgusted millions of lefter-leaning types like Napoleon, who ironically ended up providing a more convincing cause for even more millions to march to their deaths over. Mass national conscription brought an unprecedented scale of casualties, and mythologizing patriotism as a virtue worth dying and killing for would lead to the same happening later with nationalism. The Good Ol' Revolutions podcast by Mike Duncan spells it out. War is no longer a game of chess played by kings with small professional armies. It is now massive and total and horrible. Napoleon reintroduced the Bronze Age brutality of total war out of an intention to abolish the medieval brutality of feudalism. Before Napoleon, Europe was fighting small-scale territorial wars between aristocratic families for centuries. A trembling flicker of that ancient Roman dignity depicted in La Trunculorum was still fluttering somewhere in the minds of the top brass, before modernity snuffed that out. After Napoleon, the top brass became terrified of war, and managed to strike a deal that achieved a century of relative peace in Europe. That this peace is called the Pax Britannica instead of the Pax Napoleonica is one of history's bigger ironies. And all of that is why a Napoleonic setting is still so popular in the world of tabletop strategy games. And it was not an uncommon one for computer strategy games when there was a blurrier line between the two markets. The more history changes, the more some things stay the same. It's ironic, there actually may be more human beings on planet Earth playing historical Kreigsspiel today than there were in the 1800s, thanks to cutting-edge, super-modern social media technology. The International Kreigsspiel Society is a thing that exists, and they have a Discord. So anyone with any kind of Discord device can join a tutorial game specifically designed for newcomers. If you're interested in trying this out, do know that it is less intimidating than everything I just said made things sound. The umpires handle all the messy rules, and they would rather you come into this not knowing the rules. The IKS Discord is probably also the only place on the internet where posting reaction GIFs from the 1927 Abel Gance Napoleon movie is a still-living tradition. Anyways, now I don't actually want to put this lightly. This community is doing humanity itself a priceless service by keeping these 200-year-old historical games not just preserved on a shelf for display, but actually being played. And going through the experience of playing the IKS tutorial game was one of the most transformative experiences I've ever had with strategy gaming as a concept. I will never be able to think of a mouse clicking on little soldiers on top of a little map in the same way ever again. And yet the core gameplay, the basic choices and game logic going on, are all still very familiar. Now, it wasn't actually Reisswitz's rules I've had hands-on experience with here, but rather the post-mortem free Kreigsspiel rules, where basically right after Reisswitz himself died, Kreigsspiel fans adopted less complicated rules and updated them semi-regularly to the 2023 revision they were playing with me a few months ago. The other thing to know is that you're not really supposed to win.
Artillery goes here. Hey, Nappy, this has got Scrabble beat a mile. You ought to patent it.
Kreigsspiel originated as more of an open-ended military teaching tool rather than as a competitive game. The Prussians did not actually expect their generals to spend hours learning complicated wargaming rules and crunching all these numbers. Instead, they wanted to test the intuition and logic of their existing thinking habits. Until you develop an interest in umpiring yourself, you're just supposed to wing it. Until then, Kreigsspiel interfaces with you more like a social role-playing game than a traditional strategy game. So, where do we begin? For starters, you're not directly in control of your own units. The umpire is. For the IKS games, the umpire will be using Tabletop Simulator screenshots with a manually photoshopped fog of war cropped out based on visibility statistics only the umpires know. Players can use Tabletop Simulator if they want to get a more full picture of the situation, but it's not required, and just drawing on top of MS Paint JPEGs works just as well. What players do instead of clicking on their soldiers with a mouse is write their soldiers a letter with their keyboard. A hopefully very, very well-written letter, a dispatch note that is expected to say as much as possible in as few words as possible, simultaneously being exhaustive with backup plans, but also being written with precision. And that's before the umpire rolls the dice for your soldiers' reading comprehension checks. This whole game, Kreigsspiel by Post, basically feels like an over-designed writing test. Good communication is the optimal strategy. It almost comes secondhand to gaming or military knowledge. Gameplay is done via strategically privatizing Discord chat rooms. A team of 4 or so players roleplay as arguing officers who all have to agree on what orders to send their troops. For tutorial purposes, the IKS intro game has each turn lasting about 12 to 24 real-life hours that simulates 60 minutes, which is pretty unrealistic both for the game and for the setting. It's a tutorial game thing. More serious Kriegsspiel games usually simulate 20 minutes or even 2 minutes per turn, using the turn times to represent historical message delivery time. So for this play-by-post style, I got into a daily routine of discussing strategy, writing orders, submitting them to the umpire, and then waiting a day to see what they spit back out. The umpires roll their dice, crunch their numbers, and crop their screenshots, and then write your team a dispatch back. Role-playing as a soldier, reporting how well the last turn's orders went and what they should be doing next. For example, from HQ, 2 supply units, foot RT and infantry brigade. Foot artillery will join the HQ and move towards Zaitan. The regular regiment will join the logistical units and the militia, then split up to defend them to the north and south. The supply unit will begin supplying our troops at Zaitan.
It appears you have miscalculated. Though the infantry and horse artillery are quick to march to Zaitan, the foot artillery are blocking the supply wagon's way. Your men are quickly correcting errors, although it will cause delays.
Sir! We've got pink militia north of Tarshain! They almost immediately surrendered to us, seeming unwilling to fight in the least!
Mouvement stupide.
So, I was in a nice soothing routine for about 2 weeks of this, where in the mornings after waking up, I'd sip my coffee and check these messages and send some messages, and then do it again before bedtime. It was nice. It was really nice. In order to efficiently process a constant flow of new players, the IKS tutorial game is an ongoing event that cycles new players on and off an island to capture King of the Hill style objectives. I was a total newbie put on the yellow team when our cavalry stumbled upon an enemy unit who were even less prepared. They were taken completely off guard and surrendered before even having a chance to fight. They were led away as prisoners, and did you notice that the combat was resolved non-lethally? They surrendered peacefully, which is something that happens a lot in real-life history, but almost never in big dumb video games where everything's always got to be some kind of fight to the death. But here is a system that has figured out how to make non-lethal combat results and peaceful surrenders feel like an exciting, desirable, and valid outcome. In Kreigsspiel, combat is handled via verbal reports. You are only indirectly participating in the fighting. The umpire handles the micromanagement of moving all the little pieces around the board and calculating the combat to simulate how in real life, that kind of micromanagement is not available to the generals higher up on the command chain. Remember that every turn simulates tens of minutes of historical delivery time, so it is reasonable to assume that your soldiers are capable of doing something, all by themselves for at least some of those 20 minutes while they're standing around and waiting. And I liked that. I found that simulating some kind of human agency for your strategy game soldiers was not only a refreshing and new experience, but also a fundamentally different way of imagining how the most basic layers of time and space operate in a strategy game. It's a very different way of imagining all your little strategy game men as figurative rather than literal machines. There is a wonderful internal conflict here, a beautiful tension to navigate where you're constantly questioning your own known ignorance. When you're sliding tokens around in tabletop sim, you are just hoping that what you see on your own map is accurate to what's happening on the front lines 20 minutes away. The whole game is about navigating that ambiguity of information, but underneath all that ambiguity is precision, the same kind of precision of the same kind of game design algebra familiar to anyone who's played a Dungeons & Dragons style RPG. Those military officers were, and they still are, basically playing Dungeons & Dragons. Kreigsspiel is a social game about framing statistical precision around the ambiguities of something computer games are still awful at simulating: real, actual human communication. Sorry, AI bros, but you cannot play Kreigsspiel with a chatbot. Not that that stuff ever works as advertised anyway, but without real human communication, the game just wouldn't be nearly as interesting or unpredictable. Because the most interesting thing about Kreigsspiel's gameplay is how the quality of a discussion between argumentative, egotistical, and ignorant humans determines the life or death combat outcomes. Because soon after our capture of the pink team's troops, yellow team's entire effort came to an end because of infighting, or insubordination over miscommunication. One of the random teammates I was put in with was a lot more familiar with war games than the rest of us, and eventually turned into a curmudgeonly gatekeeping gamer who was getting more excited from a childish internet argument than by actually playing the game.
Misérable. Il sacrifierait tout pourvu qu'il sauve sa peau. Mais qu'est-ce que je peux bien foutre avec des gens comme ça? 2 ans de préparatifs. 150 000 hommes immobilisés. Tous ces sacrifices inutiles. Un calice quand on le guette à la lunette. Un poulain.
Things were going fine. This guy's gamer rage was absolutely embarrassing and unwarranted. Granted, their frustration wasn't fabricated out of pure lies. It sure is true that I was not able to invest at this guy's level because, after 3 weeks, some expectedly unexpected real-life emergencies eventually happened. And those were just taking too much for this kind of game, for this part of my life I'm going through. The mods were very diligent with muting and replacing the toxic gamer guy with someone more polite, but a few days later I had to back out myself, resign, and get replaced. They made me a spectator able to peep in on all the other teams' communication logs, so there was a kind of in-game going on. I didn't feel left out even after the match. After losing, you can open up the hood of the game and review all the teams and umpires' chat logs to see how it worked behind the scenes and pinpoint exactly what was happening during your session. And I was surprised to see that Pink Team's communications had it even worse. Pink Team's communication problem was not a childish gamer argument, it was a lack of activity. The little victory our cavalry won may have happened because the enemies were never given any orders to fight back at all. The umpires' logs revealed that without clearer orders, their soldiers became more interested in looting instead of fighting. Maybe they chose to surrender because they were never really ordered not to. For what it's worth, the umpires seemed to think that this exchange between yellow versus pink was very, very funny, and I agree. In other words, Kreigsspiel's vision of dynamic battlefield chaos isn't about guns and explosions and debris flying everywhere. Battlefield chaos here means shouting matches, scheduling conflicts, and clashing egos. It is the most metaphorical I've ever seen the fog of war term get stretched, and honestly, it makes a lot of sense. It was very satisfying to see this happen before my eyes, and I am absolutely interested in playing more. There's an old bit of game criticism advice I like to follow, where if you notice yourself having fun while losing, then it's probably a good game. And I can scientifically confirm with such a very rigorous test that I was having fun while losing at my very first attempt at Discord Kreigsspiel, so Discord Kreigsspiel is probably a good game. And really, half of the fun was what a good game history lesson that was. The interface players have to work with is completely different than what we're used to nowadays, but not for the umpires. The simulation running underneath is immediately familiar, using the same core concepts that will travel through history via the Napoleonic Wars to the World Wars to 1960s hippies to 2010s esports. But to bring the historical narrative back to how we got there, how this human activity changed from Kriegsspiel in the 1790s to Command & Conquer in the 1990s, I want to go back and resume the historical narrative in the 1820s, when Reisswitz Jr. was selling his Kriegsspiel to the royal courts. The Prussians loved it, and the king ordered a Kriegsspiel set for every regiment in the army. But the Russians, on the other hand, rejected Kreigsspiel, and the story behind why is a morbidly interesting aside for a minute. Reisswitz showed up to the Russian court in 1826 and made a decision that has baffled gaming historians since. He thought it would be a good idea to simulate a real-life historical battle that ended in a Russian defeat with a Russian officer who actually participated in it. As you can imagine, the Russian court was very, very offended. They theatrically kicked Reisswitz out, and this was associated with a whole downward spiral of bad decisions and bad news over a few years that eventually ended with his suicide in 1827. But Kreigsspiel continued to gain popularity without Reisswitz. Wargaming clubs and new wargames continued to appear, generally trending towards modernization of the endgame units and simplifications of the Reisswitz rules. It's after Reisswitz's death and before the World Wars that the free Kreigsspiel-style rules I was playing earlier were at their most popular. In the 1880s, American innovations started appearing, particularly with U.S. Army officer Charles L. Totten's 1880 game called Strategos, the American War Game. There is quite a historically important iteration here. Strategos used two different games in one to simulate smaller-scale individual battles within the context of a larger-scale campaign. Battles played like Hellwigian Kriegsspiel and campaigns played like Reisswitzian Kriegsspiel, marking a historical point of origin for the similarly bimodal campaign and battle modes that ship together in a lot of modern strategy games. As the 1800s were coming to a close, most Europeans were reflecting on a century of relative peace, with no great wars between any of the great powers since Napoleon. They were terrified of it happening again. His memory did not fade quickly, and as the next 3 generations after him grew up, nostalgia began developing for a Napoleonic setting. That is, big European ground wars fought over the turn of the 18th century between colorful cavalry and lined-up musketmen wearing big hats and button jackets. You can see this nostalgia in the work of Tolstoy, Tchaikovsky, or Tristram Shandy, and in the increasing popularity of toy soldiers. Nostalgia Napoleonica was pushed onto children for play, while a new pastime emerged among wealthier adults who enjoyed collecting toy soldiers and assembling them into fancy scenes for display. So a lot of the gendered father-son bonding time of the late 1800s involved dads watching their kids slap these toy soldiers together while drafting up rules for a far more civilized system for the play. This trend of wargame development needed no real-world military experience or expertise. The early 1900s were when wargaming finally started to appeal to peaceful civilians on a massive scale. Not just innocent civilians who had little interest in military matters, but loudly pacifist, literary, celebrity, intellectual type civilians who were vocally opposed to all military matters in general. Science fiction author H.G. Wells's Little Wars is the classic example here. Contrary to a lot of the quicker reads on the subject, strategy gaming itself sure did not begin with H.G. Wells. There's even a few other British competitors who beat Wells to publishing by a year or two earlier, but I digress. Wells acknowledges in the rulebook that he is iterating on a prehistoric game with barbaric implications, while using the actual German word Kreigsspiel to describe the kind of game he was working on. He knew about Kreigsspiel, but never actually played it himself, and ended up making something that was more popular than Kreigsspiel for a few years. And with that mainstream audience in mind, Little Wars is remarkably simpler. Infantry always moves half as slow as cavalry, no matter the terrain. Artillery is depicted by shooting actual toy guns, like the antique PopCap guns that shoot out little corkscrews. Nowadays, H.G. Wells fans play it with Nerf guns. The infantry doing any kind of gunfire shooting was just not depicted at all. When we're zoomed out at this scale, musket range might as well be melee range anyway. And once lines clash, the simple arithmetic of subtracting the smaller of the two forces from the larger determines the winner. Wells did include thoughts of a grander campaign outside the battles, and a bit of human sympathy, by scoring players based on how many of their little soldiers get to live another little day through retreat or surrender. The first player to score 100 points wins, and you earn only half the points for enemy soldiers slain instead of captured, which incentivizes players to win their little wars with as little death as possible. H.G. Wells had a good sense of humor about all this. In the very funny concluding section of the rulebook, he calls Little Wars a homeopathic remedy for the imaginative strategist. He passionately applauds the ethics of real-life pacifism while offering up his services to construct, for the real-life warmongers, a vast temple of war where they could all go to play war games with toy soldiers to their heart's content.
My game is just as good as their game, and saner by reason of its size.
Little Wars used a nostalgic Napoleonic setting, consciously rejecting a setting of modern combat, because H.G. Wells had a huge fear of modern combat. Wells was certainly not alone in predicting that World War I was about to happen, and when publishing Little Wars he butted heads over real-life military commanders over just how nostalgic and simple and unrealistic it was. And one of those Little Wars critics was the Colonel Mark Sykes, of the infamous Sykes-Picot Agreement. He was writing letters back and forth to Wells requesting that he update the game to depict explosive long-range artillery shells, machine gun fire, automobiles, and trains. So, H.G. Wells did. by including a sarcastic, unplayable rule set at the very end of the book that utterly breaks his game with complexity and imbalances and excessive math work. He was a funny guy. Little Wars was published in August 1913, and one of its final sentences begins by saying that Great War is at present. Capital G, capital W. 10 months later, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, and even Colonel Sykes had underestimated the technological brutality of World War I. The civilian appetite for war games in Europe just became virtually non-existent for most of the first half of the 20th century. In America, though, wargaming continued on as a non-commercial hobby for intellectual celebrity types. Though interest lagged during World War I itself, the 1920s and 30s saw the famous American engineer Norman Bell Geddes hosting fancy war games in his Manhattan apartment with authors like L. Ron Hubbard and Theodore Sturgeon, but they kept it mostly to themselves. Although news magazines were writing about these games as public curiosities, they were not sold to the public, and their authors regarded them with a bit of dark cynicism or morbid curiosity. But then, the outbreak of World War II paused any further civilian interest immediately. Toy factories in Europe were converted into producing shrapnel instead. After the wars, toy factories in Allied countries returned to peacetime by making nostalgic, placid models of idyllic farms, towns, and villages instead of soldiers. Meanwhile, toy factories in the Axis countries, on the other hand, were mostly destroyed outright.
4-engine bombers of the RAF make a heavy and concentrated attack on the German town of Brunswick. Over 800 tons of incendiaries and our best and biggest bombs set this great aircraft and industrial center blazing and wreak havoc on the intricate network.
These economic phenomena occurred during the aftermath of both world wars. I'm sorry for lumping both of them together and going fast like this, but civilian interest in further complicating the already niche hobby of wargaming was just truly at a very, very low level for like 30 to 40 years. The unimaginable complexity and scale of World War II reached a level that could no longer be literally imaginable by the human calculators who were crunching military math in their heads ever since Napoleon. World War II naval combat in particular had battleships hitting invisible moving targets over the curvature of the Earth itself. Computers, as we now know them, were developed in the earlier stages of World War II to help calculate long-range shooting, and then later to complete the atom bomb. After all of this, after the end of World War II, military war games hit a sort of design deadlock that almost sounds more like a conscientious objection or shock over how to depict the destructive power of nuclear weapons. Hardcore civilian wargaming clubs were proposing joke rules like clearing out an 8-foot radius of their house or blowing up their gaming tables with real live hand grenades. And meanwhile, the real military wargaming departments were preparing to radically rethink the concept from scratch all over again. In 1948, the US Navy coiled over 4,000 miles of wire to complete the first historical example of a strategy computer game, the Naval Electronic Warfare Simulator, or NEWS. Players were locked in rooms with radar displays showing battlefield units as blips, and this time, umpires were turning levers and knobs in an old-timey room computer to calculate damage values. Casual civilian wargaming didn't fully reappear until the 1950s. The wounds of World War II were still too fresh even to Americans, and the specter of the next big war being a nuclear war was still too frightening. Although the US recovered from its post-war fatigue faster than Europe, the re-interest in civilian war games ended up settling on game designs that were still rooted in historical Prussian rules that didn't need computers, nor a world war's worth of scale and complexity after all. It was the Korean War's return to so-called conventional combat that did it. For a while after World War II, most Western civilians had no solid vision of what a modern war would look like in the atomic age. But the attritional ground combat of the Korean War, with no atomic bombs being dropped, brought a vision of conventionality back to the Western popular imagination of what they imagined their battles supposedly looking like. Thus, the 1954 board game Tactics basically is Hellwig's Kriegsspiel circa 1799. Just with the cavalry updated to tanks and the now socially acceptable addition of dice rolling. The developer himself likely hadn't even played Hellwigian Kriegsspiel, but was still so heavily indirectly influenced that his version came out similarly nonetheless. Gettysburg from 1958 is also similarly Hellwigian, and shows Americans undergoing a similar cycle of nostalgic gaming for century-old American Civil War battles that Europeans were feeling half a century earlier towards their century-old Napoleonic war battles. But over the 1950s and 60s, mass-marketed civilian games gradually became disinterested in contemporary or modern warfare, where battles are won by overwhelming air and artillery superiority. Modern conflicts are now oftentimes referred to as asymmetrical conflicts, as if they are too abstract and too unbalanced by their nature to be easily imaginable as metaphors for competitive gameplay. The kids of the 1950s and 60s grew up with a far greater fear of war than any other generation before, and those kids would grow up to defang the military atmosphere of this hobby altogether and recast it into the realm of soft, wimpy nerds, whose tastes steered towards fantasy instead of towards simulating the next real-life war. The former soldier who spearheaded that demographic transition was British World War II veteran Navy man Tony Bath, who collected historical toy soldiers and published rules on how to game with them in the H.G. Wells tradition. Except Bath was even more exclusively interested in even older historical settings. He published rules depicting 18th century musket combat and ancient Greco-Roman combat, but it was his Untitled Medieval Rules, published for free in a 1960s tabletop gaming magazine, that became the most influential. The magazine distribution model worked like a forum. This is what internet forums were most immediately modeled after. They published readers' responses and reader rules of their own, and new designs iterated very, very fast. One of these gamer nerds arguing on this gamer forum was none other than Gary Gygax, who would iterate on Tony Bath's rules to create a medieval-themed wargame with Jeff Perrin in 1971 called Chainmail. Chainmail was a two-player, non-umpired Kreigsspiel-style wargame that depicted mass formations of troops fighting massive battles in the usual tradition, with one piece on the board representing hundreds of imaginary soldiers. But its designer kept wanting to simulate actions on an individual human scale, and also kept wanting to borrow fantasy concepts from Lord of the Rings and Conan the Barbarian. And so, later editions of Chainmail included fantasy rules in an addendum chapter. And soon, 3 years after conceiving Chainmail, Gary Gygax turned it into Dungeons & Dragons. Gygax had a big interest in historical wargaming. This entire history I've walked us through is something he was aware of and writing about in gaming magazines in the 70s. He was well aware of Kriegsspiel's umpires before reintroducing them to the world as dungeon masters. Those 3 years when Chainmail was evolving into Dungeons & Dragons represent maybe the fastest growth of a new branch in this history that connects Napoleon kicking Germany's ass in the 1800s to Warhammer 40k happening almost 200 years later. Those 3 years, 69 to 72, were also the peak years of the counterculture movement, and I've always found it kinda strange that Lord of the Rings played such a significant role in those years. At first glance, it feels odd to imagine hippies, of all types of people, falling in love with Tolkien's moralistic, nostalgic, extremely Catholic version of modern mythology, but it does make a lot of sense. Middle-earth was a more academically rigorous version of the fantasy escapism that already existed, but with a more wholesome post-war moral compass and diverse heroes who could be easily adapted to diverse game styles. Middle-earth was aspirational for a generation haunted by nuclear war, industrial pollution, and a rapidly corrupting business world. The military-industrial complex behind the Vietnam War was Mordor, while the neo-pagan farming commune was the Shire. In 1969, scans of wargame magazines show that the hobby was unsure about its favorite choice of setting. Interests were mostly split between either century or older historical recreation or a very nervously, very deliberately softened depiction of World War terrors that were still in recent memory. But with Gygax and Perrin and Dave Arneson, themselves inspired by Leonard Pat's 1970 fantasy system, the popular trends of civilian wargaming would consciously and quite suddenly make a Tolkienian objection to modern warfare, and even to the ancient classical military values themselves. In 1974, Tolkien and the counterculture movement hijacked Kreigsspiel. This same old barbaric brutality will soon be staged with a very new, very different kind of pomp and pretentiousness. For starters, consider the individuality depicted by Gygax's characters, inspired by earlier war games depicting naval combat and wild western shootouts that featured individual control of ships or people instead of formations. Traditional Kriegsspiel depicts hundreds of soldiers for each piece, but traditional D&D depicts one character per piece. And those characters have intricately simulated personalities, and rules that gamify peaceful, non-combative activities. Talking, walking, or just taking a look around are mechanical conflicts requiring that you do math and roll dice to solve. So even though there's a lot of military wargaming design in there, much of the ethos of the entire hobby of RPG tabletop gaming demonstrates an objection to military ideals, to the ideals of hive-minded unity and robotic discipline, of thinking and moving like a unit. Tabletop wargames turned into tabletop role-playing games as civilian ideals shifted towards individuality, personality, and fantasy. D&D's influence and popularity over all subsequent gaming genres and subgenres cannot be overstated. That's a topic well worth thousands of pages. After Gygax, the idea of moving representative tokens across partitioned space under competitive circumstances by players making decisions and praying for luck in a conflict against a third-party umpire, now called a dungeon master and soon a game engine, would be translated to limitless imaginative settings and new situations that transcend warfare itself. Through D&D's connection to Kreigsspiel, there is a chain of inspiration linking a virtual majority of turn-based RPGs, strategy games, and top-down management sims to a circle of 18th century German officers who were scared of Napoleon. It just seems like once you pass a certain bar of complexity for the more hardcore games, there's about 4 or 5 entire genres out there whose historical inspirations are just layers of Kreigsspiel all the way down. Kreigsspiel itself may have never been popular for the mainstream, but it has influenced nearly everything related to mainstream gaming we think of today. And as much as I would love to say that this means we can now blame the French for video games being bad, unfortunately, grand-scale narratives like that are bad because the grander the scale, the more exceptions end up getting included. There is a big gap between what most people mean when they say war games versus strategy games, which nowadays includes something only a computer can do. Crunch the numbers of a simulationist gaming system so inhumanely fast that the need to wait and take turns gets removed altogether. Most gamers who care enough probably believe real-time strategy games started with 1992's Dune 2, arriving on the concept from more arcade or console gaming origins, specifically a pair of 16-bit Sega Genesis shoot-'em-ups called Herzog from just 2 years earlier. Herzog und Herzog 2 were 2 top-down shmups with open-ended sandboxy objectives, a transformable main character, and a nasty little collection of AI minions you can deliver around the map to fight for you, capture objectives for you, and eventually assault the enemy HQ together with you. This required a lot more strategic thinking than your typical shoot-'em-up, and the multiplayer matches were, and still are thanks to netplay, incredibly ridiculously fun. But even then, while the Dune 2 team did claim a lot more influence from action shoot-'em-ups rather than strategy games, maybe that's because they were already immersed into the tabletop world completely covered with Kreigsspiel influences. Because before they were doing real-time strategy, Westwood was already a brand name for turn-based PC strategy games. They were already making PC versions of BattleTech and D&D tabletop war games. In other words, they were already making traditional Kriegspiels before making an all-new original flavor of Kreigsspiel. But there is another contender for the title of first real-time strategy game that gets less coverage, whose origins are more closely rooted in the camp of Kreigsspiel, and one that may have occupied the time of at least a couple Westwood developers before they got to work on Dune 2. And it is The Ancient Art of War, released in 1984 by the Murray siblings of Everywhere and published by Infografics. There were many versions of this game released for all the major computers of the time. The one you're seeing is the pink scale EGA version for DOS from 1984, and it is especially hard on the eyes. I mean, no version of this game is really easy on the eyes, but a few minutes of pick up and play had me feeling like it is quite easy on the fingers and a wonderful treat for the mind. I played this game in autumn of 2024, and I was very happy and surprised at how creative, elegant, and fun it still is. It must have been absolutely mind-blowing for its original audience in the 80s, who have since become a cult following, posting fondly about it to this day, but I guess all the technological limitations going on kept it from being remembered for achieving a lot of the same accomplishments Dune 2 gets more credit for. Because I can't think of any RTS genre boxes it's not ticking here. It was 10 years ahead of its time. There's edge scrolling. You control a mouse-like cursor via keyboard because computer mice weren't popular yet, and when you issue a move order, your units will follow the exact path your own cursor moves on because there's no AI pathfinding yet. You are the one who finds the path. There's even a mini-map available, even though it's super inaccurate because real actual scaling effects weren't around yet. But the core gameplay is not truly fundamentally different from Dune 2, nor is it a radical rethinking of tabletop wargame fundamentals that were around for centuries. It is real-time, it's just slower than the real-time of an RTS from the 90s. Slow enough to spot more Kreigsspiel influence going on. That Hellwigian three-way rock-paper-scissors balance is there between your three units of archers, heavy infantry, and light infantry. The terrain types and their associated status effects run us through Hellwig's list of mountains, forests, and rivers, prodding all the usual movement decisions you have thought through before. And 20 years before Rome Total War, but 104 years after Strategos, the American war game, ancient art was already doing the bimodal game systems thing. Getting good at the game means zooming in and out of a close-up view of combat, with a whole different style of graphics and controls and decisions than the zoomed-out strategic maneuvering stuff, with troop numbers and positions and even the background art synchronized across both modes, just like in a modern Total War. Taking regular breaks from the grand strategy to micromanage the humble strategy gives matches a vivid sense of pacing, and all the cuts between zoomed out and zoomed in perspectives convey a vivid sense of scale. And also what's wild is that 2 centuries of the traditional wargaming strategies and tactics just work. Archers stay in back, armor stays in front, you use V formations for attacking, U formations for defensive encirclement, straight lines for general purpose defenses. All the usual hammer and anvil tactics just work. There is a morale system and options for retreating and surrendering or capturing objectives deceptively that can allow you to win with minimal casualties on both sides. And what also impressed me was the creativity explored by these scenarios, which really stretched the imagination beyond the reality of these graphics. You'll be asked to visualize a casual foot race between gods, or even a proto-stealth mission where you have to sneak a single spy past 100 enemy units patrolling the map. Very creative, very exciting. Most of the scenarios just like to have fun, but there are also a few levels trying for more serious historical reenactment, which I think really shows just how much fun these developers were having by being among the first computer game developers at all, when the limits of their imagination were being pushed past yet another historical envelope. These graphics are from a time when you were supposed to use your imagination. The setting is all over the place. Napoleon appears next to Genghis Khan, next to Geronimo, next to the goddess Athena. With all the ancient Chinese Sun Tzu theming on the box, you are supposed to be able to visualize many, many different kinds of war going on here. Thousands of years of historical and fictional conflicts are arguably compatible with the graphics and rules here. Back in the 80s, this game was intended to appeal to the old stoic wargaming fans and the young peppy action arcade game fans both, an awfully similar trajectory of inspirations that Dune 2 would be following 8 years later. But it controls very differently. Controlling a mouse-like cursor with arrow keys means slower reaction times, and to zoom in and micromanage combat, your selection cursor needs to already be at a geographically close point on the map to the combat. Thinking strategically about where your cursor should be when is a decision I've never really had to think through when playing an RTS with the mouse. It makes the crosshair feel a little bit more like a diegetic simulated character, a vulnerable battlefield participant, like a little officer or a message runner delivering orders or something. For your orders to come through on time, you, as the cursor, need to be close. How you decide to move your cursor around is almost as decisive as how you decide to move your army around. Thinking about the strategic placement of my cursor helps shine a new light on how different of a feeling Kreigsspiel has. It has no cursor, compared to Command and Conquer. For your typical RTS, the complexity of traditional war games is vastly reduced. You cannot take all the time in the world to think over simulated time, so my psycho-strategic thinking habits for this game included a lot of wordless gut reactions, rather than the verbose back-and-forth internal dialogue my brain gets going when playing turn-based games. Additionally, there's none of that, low-tech, pre-computer, quote-unquote AI that I was experiencing with traditional Kriegsspiel, where the umpire will have your units behaving rationally on their own without your direct orders. Instead, in old-school RTS like this, they will be idling about in the middle of danger and getting themselves killed until you tell them to wake up and get out of the way. Mere seconds, no, mere frames of time of a misplaced cursor, or of overlooking idling units, or looking at the wrong part of the map at the wrong time can screw you here in a way they would not in a turn-based system. Testing your intuitive thinking skills seems to come as a second priority to testing quick reaction skills, which are capped by your computer operation skills. Clever strategy is required, but it's not going to work at all if you don't have the tech skills or reaction times. Your whole army can get pulled apart in 3 seconds. And oftentimes, those 3 seconds are spent dealing with a technical issue with the controls instead of a strategic one, but that's just climbing the learning curve, I guess. But it's also a remarkably dispassionate and kind of more inhumane and unrealistic depiction of war compared to actual Kriegsspiel with actual humans, where the umpire is fiddling with the math and machines and role-playing as your soldiers themselves. For all the advances in technology, there is now much less convincing of an illusion of humanity behind any of the little guys you're clicking around the little map. But I hope that describing the umpire as a kind of math machine person helps illustrate the continuity here. That the bedrock of most real-time and turn-based strategy games both share these same core concepts that come from a shared history. And I mean, I'm talking about concepts here as granular as units having independent hit points or strength values. For the most part, so long as a game, not even a computer game, looks like it's using some of the tabletop RPG principles from Dungeons & Dragons, then there is some kind of loose connection between that game and the Germans getting their asses kicked by Napoleon in the 1800s. Sid Meier's Civilization? It's an elaborately modified Kriegsspiel. StarCraft? It's an elaborately modified Kreigsspiel. Warhammer 40k Blood Bowl is absolutely positively an elaborately modified Kreigsspiel. And from that wide of a perspective, strategy games that are exceptions do feel like a minority. Like 1982's Utopia for the Intellivision, this is another very important candidate for the first real-time strategy game, but it's not really interested in simulating battles and combat. Hit points, strength points, the triangle balance thing are all not there. It strikes me as being relatively distant from indirect Kreigsspiel influence. I'm gonna reiterate a qualifier from like an hour ago, God, maybe even longer. This narrative is specifically interested in games depicting massive, large-scale, usually state-sponsored acts of violence. But even within that specific of a claim, I still feel like a clear majority of all strategy games I've played in my entire life are derivatives of Kreigsspiel. I'm not claiming the entire market of all strategy games ever are Kreigsspiel ripoffs, just the hardcore gamers games for gamers with competitive eye-catching battle spectacles going on, the stuff that seems marketed to me and my demographic that was so interesting for so much of my life, those are the ones I will claim are all Kreigsspiel derivative. Whereas Utopia is more like a prototypical city builder, evoking some pretty different real-life metaphors behind their mechanics, so I'm happy to acknowledge there are newer strategy game concepts starting from branches further away from the Kreigsspiel node of the tree, but so long as there's a complicated or deep mechanical interest in depicting battles, combat, or warfare, so long as you're clicking on little soldiers to move them across a little map, chances are you are playing some kind of modified Kreigsspiel. This historical narrative also shows how closely linked artistic tastes and even technological breakthroughs are to the way warfare is fought at the time, and how those forces dramatically change what imaginary warfare would or should look like from an omnipotent overhead perspective imagined by the participating societies. The ancient imagination was radically different from the Napoleonic one, which may be only kinda different from the modern imagination. And those ideological influences influence game mechanics. Kreigsspiel originated during a time of intense war prodded on by revolutionary changes in political thought. The very thought that a war could be influenced by probability or chance meant that the French Revolution played a hand in revolutionizing game history alongside everything else. And a century later, thoughts of nuclear annihilation spurred on a civilian gaming interest in medievalism and fantasy. Politics and technology turned an educational military exercise into a social hobby and then into a narrative storytelling experience, a medium for creative expression. So if you have ever felt kind of uncomfortable or weird about the callousness of strategy game concepts, if you've ever felt some kind of fear of what your decisions represent, congratulations, you were right to. Because a lot of those core concepts and rule sets were originally invented as deadly serious training tools for the real thing. But, like I said in the intro, the original idea behind this whole video was to celebrate the upcoming hit film Napoleon. If anyone here even remembers it. Things were going about as smoothly as things were going a year ago until...
Now, a majority of people who are staying here rent through Airbnb, and it's full of vendors tonight.
Firewalls is where the folks who operate the Airbnb office...
Dying was a part of life.
Oh!
So if you want to support your favorite YouTuber, consider signing up for Nebula. Nebula is a creator-owned streaming service that is bailing me out here, and it's also where the best, most thoughtful video essays can be found in one easy place earlier than on YouTube too. The Great War by Jesse Alexander in Real Time History did a 90-minute feature-length video on 3 prototypical World War I's before the real one. That is, if you are not yet tired of learning about various global-scale military conflicts before the 1910s. Or, for a bit of something different, consider learning about transportation infrastructure history with Not Just Bikes. Nebula's also been getting into actual studio quality productions with stuff like Dracula's Ex-Girlfriend, or Night of the Coconut, or Identities. And speaking as a creator, Nebula has always been a great way to support big, overambitious projects like this that take a while. Projects that would just not be doable at all under YouTube's own monetization model. So you will be supporting an economy that supports some of the most inspiring video creators alive today, and you'll be getting a bunch of exclusive content for it too. Just go to nebula.tv/superbunnyhop or scan the QR code below, and you'll get a $3 a month annual subscription, which just brings the annual total to $36 a year. That's 40% off! They're also offering a lifetime subscription for $300 for those in better situations, where you will access Nebula forever and help us invest in more big-budget, high-quality productions. Also, if you want to support your favorite YouTuber even more, consider heading on over to Twitch, where I've got a new Twitch schedule going. All Mondays from here on out are hereby declared Metal Gear Monday, thanks to the realization that I think I can play a Metal Gear one day a week and never get bored. I've gotten real good at it. I can play Metal Gear at the same time as Metal Gear at the same time as Metal Gear at the same time as Crimson Clover World Ignition or Mushihime-sama. So, I just wrapped up a non-lethal, no-trank European Extreme Foxhound Rank Cinematic Challenge run for Metal Gear Solid 3, and now I'm working on permadeathing my way through one-shot runs of the entire series. What, it's not that hard. Free Stream Fridays are wild cards, and I mean wild. I'm highlighting weird small indie games that are in need of more coverage, and knocking out some old missed classics like Final Fantasy Tactics. And Beowulf. Like the book, the 1,000-year-old poem, Beowulf.
A boiling geyser, furious fumes and flames. No one could live long in there, not without burning. Beowulf knew he couldn't fight inside the horrid lair. The dragon's heat was horrific.
And Gilgamesh. Have you never gone through Beowulf or Gilgamesh before? Come on, we can knock them out in like 2 to 3 hours. This is important stuff, gamers. Learn your roots. So Fridays are for weird indie games, or book club discussions, or movie club discussions, or karaoke parties, or productivity streams. Just some good parasocial vibes to keep all of us sane right now, because I know a lot of you watching are in great need of some kind of positive social vibes and some sense of community. And speaking of some sense of community, did you know there's an official Super Bunny Hop Discord? It's available through the Super Bunny Hop Patreon. You can come join me, specifically me, and yell at me during my actual productivity hours where I was making this video you're watching right now. Here in the Super Bunny Hop Super Bunny server, we've been having game nights, fightin' nights, movie nights, karaoke nights, and not a single one of them has been a bad night. So if you want to support your favorite YouTuber, head on over to Patreon and please throw me some fun bucks. I am in great need at the moment, frankly. Mondays, I'll be streaming Metal Gear on Twitch. On Fridays, I'll be streaming some kind of weird indie game or retro game or edutainment cultural experience. And in between, I will be hanging out in the Patreon Discord, parasocially pressuring myself to help pressure myself as I manage my emergencies. What a great idea!